Dawn breaks low over the Bismarck Sea. March 1943. The water is flat and gray, stretching endlessly beneath a ceiling of heavy cloud. Engines grow louder. Not high above the clouds where bombers are supposed to fly, but skimming just meters above the waves. Salt spray slashes across cockpit glass. Propellers claw at the air. Pilots grip their controls knowing with absolute certainty that what they are about to do is forbidden. Standing orders say aircraft must never attack ships this low. Too dangerous. Too reckless. Too easy to lose planes and crews in seconds. But down here the bombs do something different. They bounce. One skips across the sea like a stone. Then another. Then another. Within minutes, transport ships erupt in flame. Steel hulls tear open. Men jump into burning water. Convoys vanish beneath black smoke. By nightfall, dozens of ships lie wrecked or sinking. The maneuver works, brutally well. And by the time headquarters understands what just happened, it has already decided something else. This tactic will never be allowed again. Because what succeeded here terrified everyone who witnessed it, including the command that authorized the war. And to understand why, the story must widen to the world that made such a decision possible. By early 1943, the Pacific War had entered a dangerous middle phase. Japan no longer held the shock advantage of Pearl Harbor, but it still controlled vast stretches of ocean. From the Solomons to New Guinea, Japanese convoys moved almost daily, carrying troops, ammunition, fuel and aircraft parts to sustain a defensive perimeter stretching thousands of miles. One of the most critical fronts lay along the northern coast of New Guinea. Here, the Imperial Japanese Army was fighting to hold ground against Allied forces pushing north from Australia. The terrain was unforgiving. Jungles swallowed roads. Mountains cut off overland supply. Everything depended on the sea. If the convoys arrived, Japanese units fought on. If they did not, entire divisions could wither in place. The Allies knew this. But stopping the convoys proved far harder than expected. Traditional naval interception was limited. Allied surface fleets were stretched thin across multiple theaters. Submarines operated aggressively, but shallow coastal waters and heavy escort screens reduced their effectiveness. That left air power. On paper, Allied bombers dominated the skies. B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators could reach Japanese shipping from distant bases. Medium bombers like the B-25 Mitchell added flexibility. Fighters such as the P-38 Lightning extended escort range. Yet despite this strength, shipping losses were disappointing. High-altitude bombing doctrine, inherited from pre-war theory, dictated attacks from thousands of feet above the sea. Bombers flew in tight formations, releasing their payloads in patterns designed for factories and rail yards, not moving ships. The ocean, however, was not a fixed target. Bombs fell long or short. Ships maneuvered. Explosions erupted harmlessly in water. Crews watched columns of spray rise and then vanish, leaving hulls untouched. Statistically, the results were grim. Dozens of sorties might produce a single hit. Crews risked flak, fighters, and weather for negligible effect. Japanese captains learned to zigzag calmly through bomb patterns, confident that altitude worked in their favor. Frustration spread through Allied air units stationed in northern Australia. Pilots and commanders began questioning the rules they had inherited. They studied combat reports. They analyzed bomb trajectories. They listened to Australian airmen who had experimented with low-level attacks earlier in the war, tactics often dismissed by higher headquarters as undisciplined or reckless. One problem dominated every discussion: accuracy. At altitude, even minor miscalculations in speed, wind, or release timing translated into misses measured in hundreds of meters. Against ships barely longer than a football field, this margin was fatal to effectiveness. Some crews began to wonder what would happen if altitude were removed from the equation entirely. If the aircraft flew low enough, close enough, fast enough, could a bomb be placed where it actually mattered? The idea was not new. Similar concepts had been tested before the war, then shelved. Naval regulations warned explicitly against such behavior. Aircraft flying too low were vulnerable to every gun on deck. A single hit could turn a bomber into a fireball. More importantly, bombs were not designed for it. Released too low, a bomb could strike the water at a shallow angle, skip unpredictably, or even rebound toward the attacking aircraft. Safety fuses might not arm in time. Crews could be killed by their own weapons. Because of these risks, Air Force headquarters had issued strict limitations. Minimum release altitudes. Prescribed attack profiles. Clear instructions: do not improvise. But war has a way of pressuring rules until they fracture. By February 1943, Allied intelligence intercepted reports of a major Japanese convoy forming at Rabaul. Its destination, La on New Guinea's northeastern coast. The convoy was large, heavily escorted, and critically important. If it arrived intact, thousands of Japanese troops would reinforce a front already threatening Allied positions. Commanders knew they might not get another chance like this. Plans were drawn using established doctrine high-altitude bombers to weaken defenses, followed by medium bombers to press the attack. Privately, some squadron leaders discussed something else. They trained quietly. They practiced at sea level. They experimented with delayed fuses and attack angles. They understood the gamble. Success could change the war along this coast. Failure could cost entire squadrons and end careers. As the convoy sailed southward through the Bismarck Sea, the weather closed in. Low clouds and storms reduced visibility, making high-altitude bombing even less reliable. Ironically, the conditions favored the very tactic that doctrine forbade. And as aircraft warmed their engines on distant runways, a decision was being made, not yet on paper, not yet acknowledged, that would soon force headquarters to confront the consequences of what happened when rules were ignored. The stage was set for an attack that would expose the gap between theory and reality. And the moment of contact was approaching. The Japanese convoy departed Rabaul on the night of March 1, 1943. 8 transport ships. 8 destroyers as escort. More than 6,900 soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army packed below decks, along with artillery, vehicles, fuel, and food. Their destination was La. The route took them south through the Bismarck Sea, a confined stretch of water bordered by New Britain to the north and New Guinea to the south. It was a dangerous passage. Allied airfields in northeastern Australia placed the convoy within bomber range for much of the journey. Japanese planners knew this. They relied on speed, escort firepower, and weather. The convoy hugged cloud cover when possible and maintained tight formation, believing concentrated anti-aircraft fire would deter low-level attacks. Japanese doctrine assumed that Allied bombers would strike from altitude. That assumption shaped everything. Meanwhile, Allied intelligence tracked the convoy almost from the moment it sailed. Coast watchers reported sightings. Reconnaissance aircraft shadowed the ships from a distance, careful not to reveal the scale of Allied awareness. At 5th Air Force Headquarters, General George C. Kenney saw an opportunity he had been waiting for. Kenney had long criticized high-altitude bombing against ships. He believed aircraft should attack at levels where pilots could see their targets clearly and adjust in real time. Under his command, crews had already begun modifying aircraft, adding forward-firing guns, removing excess weight, and experimenting with delayed-action fuses. The B-25 Mitchell became central to this effort. Originally designed as a medium bomber, the B-25 proved adaptable. Crews fitted additional .50 caliber machine guns into its nose, transforming it into a strafing platform capable of suppressing shipboard gunners during an attack run. Bombs were modified as well. Delayed fuses ensured that if a bomb skipped into a ship's hull, it would detonate after penetrating the side rather than exploding on contact with water. The goal was not to drop bombs vertically but to place them horizontally. Officially, these methods remained controversial. Some elements of Allied command still viewed low-level attacks as wasteful and dangerous. Aircraft losses, they argued, would outweigh any gains. Pre-war manuals remained influential, and changing doctrine mid-war carried institutional risk. But Kenney pushed forward. Training intensified in northern Australia. Crews practiced flying just above wave tops, releasing bombs at precise distances, then pulling away violently to avoid blast and debris. Mistakes were unforgiving. Several aircraft were damaged during practice runs. Some pilots narrowly escaped catastrophe. Yet confidence grew. The convoy meanwhile pressed on. On March 2, Allied heavy bombers attacked from altitude. Results were limited. One transport was damaged but most ships survived. Japanese gunners grew confident. Fighter cover drove off some attackers. The convoy continued south. This was exactly what Allied planners wanted. On March 3, weather cleared just enough over the Bismarck Sea. That morning, waves of Allied aircraft assembled, B-17s at altitude, B-25s and Australian Beaufighters flying low, and P-38 fighters providing cover. The plan was layered. High-altitude bombers would disrupt formation and distract gunners. Beaufighters would strafe ships, raking decks and suppressing anti-aircraft fire. Then the B-25s would come in at mast height. This was the forbidden part. Aircraft would approach at roughly 200 to 250 miles per hour, flying barely 10 to 15 feet above the water. Bombs would be released so low that they would either skip into the side of a ship or slam directly into the hull near the waterline. No doctrine supported this. No manual endorsed it. If the tactic failed, aircraft would be torn apart by gunfire or destroyed by their own bombs. But if it worked, the convoy would have nowhere to run. Japanese ships could not maneuver sharply without breaking formation. Turning increased vulnerability. Slowing down made them sitting targets. Speed offered no protection against weapons placed at point-blank range. By late morning, Allied aircraft were inbound. Pilots checked fuses one last time. Gunners scanned the horizon. Crew chiefs tightened harnesses. Radios crackled with final instructions. Everyone understood the stakes. This was not just an attack on a convoy. It was a test of whether the rules governing air warfare at sea still applied. And in the minutes that followed, the answer would be written across the surface of the Bismarck Sea in fire, steel, and wreckage, forcing headquarters on both sides to confront what had just been unleashed. The Bismarck Sea lies exposed beneath thinning cloud. Sunlight breaks through in hard, white patches, illuminating the convoy below. 8 transports. 8 destroyers. Columns of gray smoke from earlier attacks already trailing behind them. Then the sound changes. Not the distant rumble of high bombers, but a deep, fast-growing roar at sea level. Australian Beaufighters appear first. They come in low and straight, barely above the waves, their dark shapes swelling rapidly in the vision of Japanese gunners. There is no time to adjust firing angles. No time to elevate guns. The Beaufighters opened fire. 4 20mm cannons hammer the decks of the transports. Tracers rake bridges, gun positions, and open cargo holds. Japanese crews scatter. Anti-aircraft guns fall silent as crews are killed or forced flat against steel. This is suppression, deliberate and precise. Moments later, the B-25s arrive. They do not climb. They do not circle. They come in level with the mast. Pilots hold their altitude with minute corrections, muscles locked, eyes fixed on hulls rushing toward them at closing speeds measured in seconds. Spray explodes around propellers. Wind buffets fuselages violently. Japanese sailors stare in disbelief. Bombers are not supposed to be here. The first bombs release. They strike the water at shallow angles and skip. Once, twice. Then slam into the sides of ships just above the waterline. Delayed fuses tick invisibly. Explosions follow inside the hulls. Steel plates bulge outward. Flames burst from cargo spaces. Entire sections of a ship's interior are torn apart before the blast vents through the side. One transport erupts in a rolling fireball, its bow lifting clear of the water before collapsing back into the sea. Another lists sharply, its engines destroyed, smoke pouring from shattered superstructure. Japanese destroyers attempt evasive maneuvers. They turn hard, increasing speed, throwing up white wakes. But turning exposes their sides. Low-level bombers do not need prediction. They aim where the ship is, not where it will be. More bombs skip. More hulls rupture. The sky fills with overlapping sound, engines, explosions, machine gun fire, the tearing scream of metal under stress. Anti-aircraft fire becomes frantic and disorganized. Guns fire too high or too low. Tracers streak uselessly overhead or vanish into the sea. Some Japanese gunners manage to hit aircraft. A B-25 takes fire in an engine and veers away trailing smoke. Another is struck along the fuselage but holds course long enough to release its bomb before pulling up violently, barely clearing the blast radius. Losses occur but not enough. The attack does not pause. Wave after wave presses in, exploiting the chaos. Ships already damaged are hit again. Fire spread. Ammunition detonates. Lifeboats are lowered into burning water. By early afternoon, the convoy is no longer a formation. It is a scattering of wrecks. Transports slow dead in the water. Some sink by the bow, others roll slowly onto their sides before capsizing. Destroyers attempt to rescue survivors, only to come under renewed attack. Allied aircraft circle back, targeting anything still afloat. The sea becomes littered with debris, planks, crates, oil slicks, bodies. Smoke columns rise thousands of feet, visible from miles away. For the Japanese soldiers trapped below decks, escape is often impossible. Compartments flood rapidly. Flames block passageways. Many never reach the surface. Those who do find the water itself hostile. Fuel burns on the surface. Aircraft strafe lifeboats and swimmers, not out of cruelty, but to prevent survivors from reaching shore and rejoining the fight. This is war stripped of distance and abstraction. By mid-afternoon, the outcome is no longer in doubt. All 8 transports are sinking or sunk. 4 destroyers are destroyed. The remaining escorts flee northward, damaged and carrying survivors. The Bismarck Sea is silent again except for fire and the sound of waves against wreckage. In a single day, the Japanese attempt to reinforce La has been annihilated. Nearly the entire convoy is gone. And for the Allied crews returning to base, the realization settles in slowly. What they were told should not work, what they were warned never to attempt, has just produced one of the most decisive convoy destructions of the war. But even as victory reports are written and damage assessments compiled, a different reaction begins to form far from the smoke and water. At headquarters. Because the success of this maneuver raises a question that cannot be ignored. If this worked so completely, why was it ever forbidden? And what does it mean for a war where rules are supposed to limit risk, but reality keeps rewarding those who break them? The answer begins to take shape as reports move up the chain of command. And the reaction will be as consequential as the battle itself. By evening on March 3, 1943, the reports reaching Allied headquarters were almost unbelievable. Air crews claimed that nearly the entire Japanese convoy had been destroyed. Transports sunk outright. Destroyers crippled or burning. Enemy air cover scattered. Losses far exceeding anything previously achieved against shipping in the Southwest Pacific. At first, staff officers assumed exaggeration. Combat reports often were. But reconnaissance aircraft sent back over the Bismarck Sea the next morning confirmed it. Wreckage stretched for miles. Oil slicks marked where ships had gone down. Only fragments remained of what had been a vital supply lifeline. The numbers were stark. 8 transports sunk. 4 destroyers destroyed. Over 3,000 Japanese troops killed, many more wounded or missing. The entire reinforcement effort to La wiped out in less than 48 hours. Allied losses were comparatively light. A handful of aircraft shot down, crews lost, painful but nothing close to the devastation inflicted. From a purely operational standpoint, it was a triumph. From a doctrinal standpoint, it was a shock. Within days, detailed after-action reports circulated through 5th Air Force, then onward to higher command. They described attack altitudes measured in feet. Bomb releases at distances normally considered suicidal. Aircraft deliberately flying through walls of flak to place bombs directly against hulls. Some senior officers were impressed. Others were alarmed. The maneuver violated long-standing assumptions about air warfare at sea. It depended on extraordinary pilot skill, precise coordination and ideal conditions. It exposed aircraft to concentrated fire. A single misjudgment could wipe out an entire crew. Most troubling of all, it worked too well. At the highest levels, commanders began asking uncomfortable questions. What happens when the enemy adapts? What happens when ships increase light anti-aircraft weapons? What happens when inexperienced crews attempt to copy this without proper training? The fear was not that the tactic was ineffective, but that it was uncontrollable. Headquarters also had to consider precedent. If low-level mast height attacks became standard, aircraft losses could spike dramatically across other theaters. Not every commander had Kenny's preparation, his modified aircraft, or his carefully trained crews. Doctrine exists to manage risk at scale. And this maneuver shattered doctrine. As a result, what followed was not universal adoption, but restriction. Officially, skip bombing and mast height attacks were acknowledged as successful under specific conditions. Unofficially, headquarters moved quickly to limit their use. New directives emphasized that such attacks required explicit authorization. Training was tightly controlled. Only selected units were permitted to employ the technique. In some commands, the tactic was quietly discouraged altogether. The language in orders was careful. No outright condemnation but clear warnings. Aircraft commanders were reminded of acceptable altitudes. Risk assessments were tightened. Deviations from approved profiles required justification. In effect, the maneuver was placed behind a bureaucratic wall. Not banned in name, but banned in practice. For the Japanese, the impact was immediate and devastating. The loss of the convoy at the Bismarck Sea forced a fundamental change in logistics. Large troop movements by sea near Allied airfields became impossible. Reinforcements were broken into smaller groups. Barges replaced transports. Night movements became the norm. But none of these methods could replace what had been lost. La would eventually fall. The Northern New Guinea campaign tilted decisively in Allied favor. And all of it traced back to a single day, and a single decision to ignore the rules. Among aircrews the lesson was different. They had seen what happened when distance was removed from war. When pilots looked their targets in the eye. when bombs were not dropped statistically but personally. Many believed this was the future of anti-shipping warfare. But the future would not arrive openly. Instead, it would exist in margins, special units, special missions, tightly controlled environments. Because the same maneuver that sank nearly 40 ships in a matter of days had also revealed something unsettling. War rewards innovation. Institutions fear it. And somewhere between those two truths, headquarters made its choice. The Bismarck Sea would stand as proof of what was possible, and as a warning of what could not be allowed to become routine. The battle was over. But its consequences were only beginning to ripple outward, into strategy, into doctrine, and into the long aftermath that followed when victory came at the cost of rewriting the rules. In the days following the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, the silence over the wreckage lingered longer than expected. Smoke drifted for days. Oil slicks spread and thinned. Broken hulls slowly disappeared beneath the surface. For Japan, the loss was catastrophic. The annihilation of the convoy removed any realistic chance of reinforcing WWII. Entire regiments had been lost without ever reaching the battlefield. Weapons, vehicles, and supplies intended to stabilize the front were now scattered across the ocean floor. Japanese command quickly understood the implications. Future convoys of similar size were no longer viable. Air superiority had shifted decisively. The Allies had demonstrated not only reach but precision, the ability to destroy shipping at will when conditions aligned. As a result, Japanese logistics shifted to desperate alternatives. Smaller vessels, coastal barges, night-only movements hugging shorelines. These methods reduced losses but strangled capacity. Supplies arrived slowly and in insufficient quantities. Units already under pressure found themselves fighting without adequate food, ammunition, or medical support. Morale suffered. Soldiers who survived the sea attack carried its memory forward. Reports circulated describing aircraft flying at mast height, bombs skipping across water, ships exploding from the inside. The psychological impact was profound. The sea, once a protective barrier, now felt exposed. For the Allies, the victory reinforced air power's central role. The battle validated Kenny's emphasis on innovation and pilot initiative. His approach would influence subsequent operations throughout the Southwest Pacific, where air interdiction became the primary method of isolating Japanese forces. Yet within official channels, the reaction remained cautious. After-action reviews acknowledged the success but stressed the exceptional circumstances. Weather, surprise, Japanese formation rigidity, crew training, modified aircraft. The message was subtle but clear. This was not a universal solution. In Europe, where shipping lanes were heavily defended and skies contested by dense fighter coverage, such tactics were viewed as impractical. Even in the Pacific, commanders worried that repeated use would erode surprise and dramatically increase aircraft losses. Thus, skip bombing became a specialist tool. Units trained in it retained the knowledge. Manuals referenced it briefly. But for most air crews, the approved methods remained unchanged: altitude, formation, and standardized attack profiles. Behind the scenes, Air Force safety boards took notice. They analyzed crash rates during training, studied the margin for error, examined how close some aircraft came to self-destruction. The conclusions reinforced headquarters' unease. This was a weapon that demanded perfection, and perfection could not be guaranteed at scale. Still, the damage had been done, or rather, the lesson had been learned. The Japanese never again attempted a large daylight troop convoy within range of Allied land-based aircraft in this theater. The risk was simply too high. The Bismarck Sea had become a warning zone. Strategically, this shifted momentum. The inability to reinforce by sea accelerated Japan's gradual withdrawal along New Guinea's northern coast. Isolated garrisons became liabilities rather than assets. The Allies advanced step by step, bypassing strong points and cutting supply lines from the air. The battle's influence extended beyond maps and logistics. It reshaped thinking. Aircrews understood that doctrine could be wrong, that survival sometimes depended on adaptation rather than compliance. At the same time, headquarters reinforced the idea that innovation must be controlled, not unleashed freely. Between those two positions lay a tension that would define much of the remaining air war. The sea attack at the Bismarck Sea had ended in a clear victory, but it also exposed the fault line between battlefield reality and institutional caution. And that fault line would continue to widen as the war moved forward, into new theaters, new technologies, and new debates over how far rules should bend before they break. Those debates would shape the long-term legacy of what happened here, a legacy that would only fully emerge after the fighting moved on. As the war progressed, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea quietly took on a second life, not on the battlefield but inside planning rooms and training commands. The results were undeniable. But the method remained controversial. Within Allied air forces, skip bombing was studied, dissected, and cautiously categorized. It appeared in technical bulletins and classified evaluations. Diagrams showed bomb trajectories skimming water. Tables compared hit probabilities at altitude versus mast height. Yet the language was always restrained. The maneuver was described as situational, effective only under controlled conditions, dependent on exceptional crew proficiency. This framing mattered. It allowed headquarters to acknowledge success without endorsing widespread use. The tactic was preserved but placed under glass, available to specialists withheld from the majority. By late 1943, anti-shipping warfare began to evolve in other directions. New weapons emerged. Airdrop torpedoes improved. Radar-guided bombing increased accuracy. Naval coordination tightened. These developments offered safer, more repeatable ways to attack ships without exposing aircraft to point-blank fire. In comparison, mast-height attacks looked increasingly risky, a solution born of necessity rather than design. As a result, skip bombing slowly faded from prominence. It did not disappear. But it no longer defined doctrine. The units that had pioneered it carried the knowledge forward, but often without the same conditions that had enabled its success. When attempted elsewhere, results were mixed. Losses mounted. Commanders pulled back. The lesson hardened. What works once, even spectacularly, does not always scale. For Japan, the legacy was more immediate. The destruction of the convoy accelerated a strategic retreat that would continue through 1943 and 1944. Airfields fell. Supply lines shrank. The initiative shifted decisively to the Allies in the Southwest Pacific. The psychological damage endured as well. Japanese naval officers became acutely aware of air power's lethality at close range. Convoy tactics emphasized dispersion and concealment. Daylight movement became rare. The sea, once a conduit of strength, became a zone of constant threat. Yet even these adaptations could not reverse the imbalance. The Allies had learned how to isolate enemy forces without costly frontal assaults. The Bismarck Sea had demonstrated that logistics, not just firepower, decided campaigns. Within Allied memory, however, the battle occupied an ambiguous place. It was celebrated, but it was also quietly fenced off. No medals were awarded specifically for inventing the tactic. No formal doctrine was rewritten to enshrine it. The story survived largely through after-action reports and pilot recollections. In institutional terms, this was deliberate. Headquarters sought to avoid encouraging imitation without oversight. The risk of young crews attempting low-level attacks without proper preparation was considered unacceptable. In that sense, the maneuver was effectively banned forever, not through prohibition but through omission. It became a historical footnote rather than a standing order. Yet for those who flew that day, the memory remained vivid. They remembered the height of the waves, the sudden silence of suppressed guns, the moment when bombs skipped exactly as hoped. They had seen the rules fail, and reality take over. And as the war moved on, new technologies and strategies took center stage, built not on improvisation, but on systems designed to reduce reliance on individual daring. The Bismarck Sea faded from headlines. But its influence lingered, because it marked a moment when warfare briefly escaped the constraints of theory, and proved that sometimes, the most dangerous ideas are the ones that work too well. That realization would echo long after the wreckage disappeared beneath the water. And it sets the stage for a final question, not about tactics or ships or bombs, but about what this moment reveals about war itself. The Bismarck Sea stands today as more than a battlefield. It is a lesson in human ingenuity, risk, and the unpredictable consequences of breaking rules. For a single day, a handful of pilots challenged doctrine. They ignored prescribed altitudes, accepted extraordinary danger, and placed bombs with near-perfect precision. The result was devastating: 40 ships sunk, thousands of lives lost, and a strategic shift that reverberated across New Guinea. Yet the very success of this maneuver ensured it would not be repeated freely. Headquarters recognized the thin line between brilliance and catastrophe. What worked under ideal conditions could not be replicated safely at scale. Mast-height attacks were preserved in manuals, but only as a tool for specialists. For the majority, the lesson was clear. Innovation may win battles, but it does not always survive bureaucracy. The battle also illustrates a deeper truth about warfare. Rules exist to mitigate risk, maintain order, and protect lives. But in practice, War favors those willing to adapt, to test boundaries, and to seize fleeting opportunities. In the Bismarck Sea, the rules were momentarily suspended, and reality revealed both its power and its cost. Strategically, the destruction of the convoy accelerated Japan's retreat in New Guinea, demonstrating that logistics, more than heroism, often decide the outcome of campaigns. Psychologically, it underscored the terror of modern air power, a force capable of annihilating supply lines, lives, and morale in hours. Yet there is a human element often overlooked. Pilots and crews faced death not abstractly but up close, low over the waves, dodging fire, trusting skill over doctrine. Their courage shaped the course of the battle, even if history would later fence it in as an anomaly. The Bismarck Sea reminds us that warfare is never only about rules or machines. It is about people confronting uncertainty, testing limits, and discovering, sometimes at terrible cost, what is possible. It asks us to consider the tension between innovation and control, between daring and caution, a tension that defines not only war but the human experience itself. And in that quiet, smoky aftermath, the ocean slowly reclaimed its wrecks, leaving behind a lesson written not in manuals, but in steel, fire, and memory.